Hey, Resurrection Church, we are so glad that you have decided to worship with us. So if you have a prayer request or a question about anything, feel free to email us at reschurchnc@gmail.com, or you can find us on Facebook and we can answer you that way. We are so excited to hear what God has to say this morning. We know that it's going to be a faith-filled message inspired by God, no matter who's bringing the word. And we are so glad and excited to have you worshiping with us. And if you make a decision for Christ, we want to hear about it. So email us at that email address I gave you earlier, or hit us up on Facebook. We just want to connect with you and get to know you and tell you more about this Jesus Christ that we are worshiping this morning. So thank you for joining us for worship, and we cannot wait to see you in person, or send us a message or comment below. We just cannot wait to connect with you and get to know you more and tell you more about this Jesus Christ that we love. Thank you for joining us.
I titled this morning, Raising the White Flag. This message from the book of Jonah actually could have just as easily been titled, a God of mercy, or it could have been titled a God that wants to see repentance, or it could have been, there's so many different things about the book of Jonah, but if I had to do it over again, I would probably say, it's not about you. And listen, this Jonah has a lot of that aspect in it. Now, if you remember, if you were here last week and heard the message last week where it was in Hebrews, and we actually took the text in chapter 7, but it was talking about Jesus being our high priest. And it ended up there in chapter 10. And in chapter 10, and I kind of gave you an assignment. I don't know if anybody read through that or not, but when you get to chapter 10, it says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching. Now, this is kind of a side point that goes into what I want to talk about somewhat. But we so often, now don't get me wrong, I want you to hear this. Please don't get me wrong. When we think that coming here is only about God, and in a sense it is, but when we think that that's what it is, it becomes work to do that, then we don't realize that our service to God is outside of here. Our service to God is all the time, in theory, in essence. And this is really, Hebrews 10:25 is the only verse that pastors can get up and guilt people on about. You should need to be here every time the door's open. But it doesn't say that you're coming to worship God. It says to come to exhort one another. So it's not about you, it's about exhorting one another. And that is why coming together is so important. Listen, if you're a Christian, you should be worshiping, you should be honoring, you should be talking to God all the time. We come here to get together with one another, to exhort one another, to love one another, and then worship God. But when you worship God, when we all worship Him together, we are in unity. And that's what's so extremely important. And when we come and we understand that we're worshiping God, we exhort one another, and that's what is so important. In the book of Jonah, listen, there are so many different thoughts out there about, there's always skeptics, there's always somebody out there that says, well, there's no way that a whale can swallow somebody. They say the esophagus is too small, and you can go through all this. Now listen, I could go into so many sidetracks here, but just say this. Number one, it's a big fish. Now the King James does say in Matthew chapter 12, it calls it a whale, but that's just how they translate it. I don't know if it was a whale, it probably may have very well been a whale. I also don't know how big Jonah was. Jonah may have been 18 inches tall for all I know. I don't know. But if I read this as an actual story, it talks about actual places, an actual person, actual events. It doesn't say that Jonah was called to go to Narnia. If he did, then we would say, this is just another C.S. Lewis story, and this is a good story trying to bring out a great analogy or a great, learning process. But he talks about Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria at that time. Now, having said all that, if you don't believe that the story of Jonah is an actual story, at least read it to learn about what God is trying to tell us through the book of Jonah. Now, Jesus Christ mentions Jesus himself in what we have in Scripture, the whole New Testament, what we have written here. He only spoke of 4 prophets. Only 4 that he mentioned by name. That was Isaiah, which is a big book. He was a major prophet. You're either a major or a minor prophet, and that's depending on whether it's a big book or a little book. That doesn't mean that they were more important or less important. But Isaiah, he was a major prophet. Then Jesus mentioned Daniel. He mentioned Zechariah. Both of them have about 12 to 14 chapters, and they had some prophecy in them. And he mentions Jonah. And Jonah, literally, Jesus not only does he mention him, but he said his life, the fact that he was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, is a sign of me. It's a sign of my coming. I will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And he uses Jonah to say he was a prophesying of me and what I will do. And so that you have to look at that as obviously it's something that he wanted us to learn from. It's something that Jesus himself thought that it was a real story. And so I tend to believe it was a real story. I think the book of Jonah is an actual event. Now, who wrote it? It doesn't say, I, Jonah, am writing this. I don't know who wrote it. I mean, Jonah's the one that would have known the events better than anybody, but if you take the criteria of embarrassment, then Jonah, he didn't talk very highly of himself. And really, if you talk to a Muslim sometime, they will tell you one reason they don't believe the Scriptures is because it's so unfavorably to some of the people in there. But that's all the more reason why I believe it's true. They told the truth. They didn't try to embellish it. And Jonah, when you read this, Jonah's really not a hero. I mean, in a sense, he was, but listen, God had to take him to a place where I don't ever want to go in order to say, okay, I'm going to do it. I'll do it. It may not be what I want to do, but I'm still going to do it. And that's where raising the white flag comes in. There comes a point when we're running. If you're running from God, maybe you're in here this morning, maybe you're running from God. Maybe there's a sense and a calling on your life that you sense and you're like, I just can't do it. I don't do it. Maybe it's something in your actual life about, maybe it's a marriage problem that you're in. Maybe it's a work problem and you just want to run from it. You don't want to address it. Well, if there comes a point when you just have to raise the white flag and understand sometimes it's not just about you. Listen, I say this book. I actually heard a little YouTube one the other day, a little point in here. It's one reason why I started studying the book of Jonah. But this book, as I studied through this week, I thought, this is really a lot just for me, if it's not for anybody else. I've had some of these same issues in my life, maybe with people, and I'm just like, well, God, how can you really bless them? Who am I to say that? So when you read the book of Jonah, now I'm just going to take some verses in chapter 3, but before we get there, as I like to teach, I just want to summarize what's going on in the book of Jonah. Now, Jonah was a guy that we only know where he was from because the history book of the 2nd Kings tells us that he was from Beth Heifer, or Gath Heifer, I think is the name of it. Hefer, something along those lines, but it was close to Nazareth, which is about 80 miles north of Jerusalem. That's somewhere around that area is where he was from. And God says, I want you to go to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was around 500 miles northeast. That way. And Jonah went south to Joppa. And he says, about 100 miles south or so, he goes and he says, I'm going to get on a ship to Tarshish. I may be pronouncing it wrong, but you understand where I'm going with this. But he said, now if you look at a map, which I don't have one up for you, but the known world, the Mediterranean Sea, and if you're looking at the map, you've got Jerusalem to the right or to the east of the Mediterranean Sea, then Joppa, Nazareth would be north, and if you look all the way over to the west, as far as a map would go at that point in time, was Spain. Now, unless people at that time knew about North and South America, but we don't realize that they know about it, and that was the end of the world. Jonah literally was called to go to Nineveh, and instead he wanted to go to the other end of the world, literally 2,200 miles away, which would have get there. That's where he was headed. He was so set on not going to Nineveh that he said, I can't do it. I'm going this way. And so he's out on a ship, and I'm going to summarize basically chapter 1, but these I guess you could call them pagans. They were unbelievers. The ship, people that run the ship, it's in a storm, and they're like, something's going on. And they look at Jonah and they said, call out to your God. And there's no reference that Jonah ever did that. And listen, Jonah was in a bitter place in his life. I really believe that. And he may have had good reason to be. But yet that's where he was at. And God had to bring him to the depths of despair to get him out of there. And they look at him and say, call on your God. And he never says anything about it. And they say, so they draw lots. Now, in the Old Testament, and even honestly in the New Testament, we see a lot of instances where they draw lots. I don't recommend doing it, okay? It would be almost like you flipping a quarter, saying, okay, am I going to pick, okay, I'm going to marry one of these girls. Let's see, heads, it's, so-and-so, and tails, it's okay, well, this must be the way it's supposed to be. That's what drawing lots was like, in a sense. Whether it was these little sticks that they would put in their hands, some people say, and each man would draw one out, and one of them was shorter than all the rest of them, and they're like, okay, it's you. I mean, there was a method they did, and that's basically what it was. Even Moses, when he divided the land of children of Israel, when it says by lot, for years I thought that just meant a lot, like the size of a piece of property. Like, oh, you got this lot, I got that. People say that he was literally drawing lots to decide who went to what. Over 70 times it's mentioned in the Old Testament, I think 70 in the New, about casting lots. Well, they cast lots to see why the storm was happening. And the lot fell on Jonah. They said, okay, what do we need to do? And he said, throw me overboard. And they were more compassionate on him than Jonah was on the Ninevites. It said, but they rowed. They were thinking in their minds, we can't just throw this guy overboard. And this storm just got worse, and you know what they did? They threw him overboard. They got to the point where they had to throw up their own white flag, and they said, okay, if this is really what's going on, we're getting rid of the problem. And they threw him overboard, and this is what the Bible says, and God prepared a great fish. I mean, he prepared this. If I believe, and I do, I believe that God just spoke the world into existence. Surely, I believe that he could prepare a fish that could swallow a man if he wanted to. He can do whatever he wants, and it said he prepared it. Maybe he made this fish just for this. Maybe this poor fish lived for years wondering what on earth its purpose was, and all of a sudden, here comes Jonah, and the thought occurred to that fish, okay, there's my one purpose in life, here it is. And he swallows Jonah, and as the Bible tells us, he was in he said, from the belly of hell is the way the King James puts it. I cried. Sheol, I think's a word there. But he literally was at a place, and now Jonah finally prays. Listen, I've just been in the middle. Listen, I didn't even learn to swim until I was 27 years old. Now, you can laugh. I'm just telling you the honest truth about me. And so I have a healthy respect of water. I still can't swim very good, just to be quite honest. Probably in the end, could beat me in a lap race. I'm just not that good at it. But when you put me out on the water and I can't see the bottom, you might as well just let me go back over to the bank, get on the shore, because I do not like it. I remember one of Laura's cousins, her husband took me out fishing, and they lived on the coast down by Charleston, St. John Island, I think St. James Island, something like that. Anyway, we went out with him, and there's this part of a ship sticking up out of the thing. He getting this little tiny boat, and we got to go over there. He wants me to tie off to it. And I'm like, I just can't do it. I said, you can just send me back over there. Just something about being out in that dark water and just some big ship sticking out of it. I just couldn't do it. Listen, I'm just telling you right now that the thoughts of a big fish swallowing me, I think I'd probably pray too. But I'd like to think I would do it before it got to that point. I mean, Jonah is in the depths of despair. And in chapter 2, if you read through the book of Jonah, it's only 4 short chapters. The book, chapter 2, is basically a prayer. It's basically Jonah's prayer. You can look that up. I'm not going to take time to read it. But in chapter 2, it's basically what it is. And this is how chapter 2 ends like this. It says, "And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited up Jonah on dry land." Now, don't underestimate how God is still in control of everything in nature. I mean, you may be having a hard time paying your bills. And God could prepare a rabbit beagle to go pick up somebody's wallet or something, or whatever the case is. I mean, God can do whatever He wants to provide for you. And in this sense, He has this fish prepared just for Jonah. The fish vomits him up. And so from here, then you get into chapter 3. It said, "Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time." Now, I want you to understand that word, the second time. God is a God of second chances. Now, we could just stop there. I could have titled this the God of second chances. And I want to throw this in, too, while I'm thinking about it. We often give Jonah a hard time because he didn't like the Assyrians. He didn't want to go there. Now, there's 17 prophecy books in the Old Testament. You have 17 books of the history. Then you have 5 books in the middle, which is, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Then you have 17 prophecy books behind that. And that's the 39 books in the Old Testament. So you got all those prophecy books in there. And every one of them but 2 is written to the Israelites in one sense or another, either the 10 northern tribes or the 2 southern tribes. Only 2 books in the whole Old Testament is written to someone other than the children of Israel. One of them was the book of Jonah. So let me put it like this. Let's say God calls you. Let's say you're from the north, okay, and God calls you to be a prophet to the northern people. To New York, Maine, Vermont, some of those areas, and that's your people, and God wants you to prophesy to them. And say, we're living down here in North Carolina, and He calls me or somebody else and says, I want you to talk to your people down in the South. And so I'm the prophet now to North Carolina, South Carolina, and all this. And that's how some of the prophets are, and some of them are the prophets to the northern 10 tribes. There's a couple of them that live in the South, and God says, I want you to go to the north. Well, that's a hard job. If you got to go from North Carolina and you go up north and try to talk to them, the same as if they come down here and everybody thinks the other one's a little bit crazy or something. I don't know why. Sometimes it's just the way you talk. But Jonah wasn't called to either the north or the south. He was called, almost like we would think, to go to Afghanistan. Jonah was called to go to the Assyrians, the people that probably killed his family. In the 700s, if you look at the history, the Bible even talks about it, the history, the 10 northern tribes were carried away as slaves by the Assyrians. That's where Jonah lived. That's where his family was carried as refugees or as slaves to the Assyrians. And now God says, I want you to go to them. Listen, Jonah was a very unique prophet. If I was called to go to people who had killed my family, to go to my enemies and talk to them, then listen, I would probably have a hard time doing that. Only 2 prophets were told to do that. And Jonah's one of the main ones. So if you think about it like that and think, okay, now I can see a little bit why Jonah didn't want to do it. And so Jonah's there, and he said, the word of the Lord came to him the second time. And God is a God of second chances. And He says, arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it. The message that I tell you. Now, the video I was watching this week was basically about how Jonah fulfills Jesus Christ's prophecy, or how Jesus fulfills Jonah's prophecy. And the guy stuck on this word for just a second. I've never caught this. And really, the word arise can be used in different contexts. But he said the Hebrew word there is kum, or kum. I think it's K-O-U-M in some spellings, some it's C-U-M-I. But it goes on. If you look in the book of Mark, when that 12-year-old girl is dead and Jesus Christ talks to her, he said, Talitha Kuma. She's dead, and He says, arise. He uses the same word that they use here as the word arise. And so he was saying, we say, how on earth would Jonah have lived? He said, if maybe he didn't. Maybe God just rose him up. Either way, he's living now. Either way, it's a miracle. Either way, it's what happened. Either way, it's a story that Jesus Christ confirms is real. And here you see he comes out, he's arisen, and then he gets in, and I'm going to just skip through this. And Jonah, he walked through the city. It says it was a big city. And it says in verse 4, it says, Jonah began to go in the city a day's journey, and he called out, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." Now, you could also title this, "The Worst Sermon in the World." Jonah has one opportunity to be a prophet. He's called to these people. Jonah didn't want to go. He goes to his enemies, and it says the city's a 3-day journey. I don't think it meant that it would take him 3 days to walk across it, because it says at the end of the book there's 120,000 people there, which is a big city, but it probably took him that long to get through everything. But Jonah goes through there, and that's what he says. 40 days and the city will be overthrown. And you're like, is that it? I mean, he didn't say anything about God's grace. He didn't say he can be merciful to you. It's almost like he's just saying, I mean, you can almost picture Jonah. He didn't want to go in the first place. 40 days and then it must be over. I mean, how would you act? How would I act? And it says in the original Hebrew, this is 5 words. And my first initial thought was when Paul said, I'd rather speak 5 words with understanding than 10,000. Where you can. We're in an unknown tongue, is what he says. He speaks 5 words, yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. Now, when I started looking at this, and it's almost like it could be a play on words, because was Jonah bitter, or did he just tell him what God told him to? It says, God said, go out and speak what I tell you to tell them. He says 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. Now, if you just look up, I just use the Strong's Concordance. It's an extremely simple tool. It's the same tool that people were using in 1950 to study basic meanings of words. And I got it on my computer, and you just hit that, and it says it can mean overthrown, it can mean turn around. So in theory, in essence, this came true because Nineveh did turn around. 40 days, and Nineveh turned around. See, this is what made Jonah so upset. It says, and the people of Nineveh believed God, verse 5. They called for a fast. They put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them to the least. The word reached the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. And he issued a proclamation and published through Nineveh, by decree of the king and his nobles, let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock taste anything. Let them not feed or drink water. I mean, this is the king of the known world, so to speak. He's the king that took over the Israelites. And Jonah comes in and speaks 5 words, and the king says, all right, that's it, boys. Y'all don't need anything, because we're going to turn this thing around. Now, in a humorous little thought, some people said, well, I guess if Jonah came out of that well bleached white, which they say would probably be what would happen, his hair is probably standing up and matted together. He looks like he'd been bleached because he'd been in a stomach for the last 3 days, and they all saw him and thought, I don't know what he's going to do, but I'm going to listen to this guy. And Jonah's just like, 40 days and then it'll be overthrown. And the king's like, okay, let's stop everything. They literally, God had mercy on the whole Assyrian Empire because Jonah went in and said, 40 days and yet Nineveh should be overturned. And when you read through here, basically it says, the last verse 10 of chapter 3 says, when God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil way, God relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did it not. And Jonah goes into chapter 4, and he's like, I know you didn't put this up, but it displeased Jonah exceedingly. That's how chapter 4 starts. I mean, this is what God called him to do, and Jonah gets upset about it. Why? Because God had mercy on them. Now see, if it was all just about, now, We could say, well, the whole Old Testament's about Israel. And listen, if there's one word that I could say today that would, in me, is enough to confirm that God is who He said He was, that Jesus Christ is who He said He was, it's Israel. If you look at what they've been through, down through the dawn of time, if you just look at historically, even where the Bible brings them, from a man named Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, you could look at the history of it, and it's there. And over, people have tried to destroy them, and yet they're still there. And they will remain there. But we could say, well, the whole Old Testament's about Israel. But no, God, He didn't. He's even talking to the enemies of Israel here. He calls out to Assyria and says, I'm giving you a space to repent. And they did. And God has mercy on them. And you go through chapter 4, and here's basically what happens. Jonah in chapter 4. He builds this booth. I don't know what it looked like. If you've ever, watched Mountain Men, which is on the History Channel. We got a couple of seasons of it on Prime. I like the show. I'm surprised my wife likes it too. And I think it's season 3 where Charlie from Maine goes out. And he's got this tree laid this way. And he just takes branches and puts over top of it and lives in it for like 2 months. I kind of almost pictured the booth just being something. I don't know if it was like that or not, but said he sat down to get in the shade, and this is what it says. Jonah sat there to see what would happen to the city. Even through all that, Jonah just sat there just thinking, surely he's still going to destroy them. I mean, this is Jonah, the prophet. And he looks out at his enemies, and he is so upset. Now listen, I wouldn't want to say that I have enemies in my life. I'm just thinking of me personally, because I know if I'm this way, then you're this way. There's somebody in your life, if you're over the age of 5, there's someone in your life that has done something to you at some point, and you're just like, you don't even have to say that. You just stand like this sometimes. If you grit your teeth, just enough, or maybe you make your fist. You may not hit them, but deep down you probably want to. And you're just like, I don't know. I don't know how God can be in this. Maybe it's somebody. Maybe it's someone at work. Hopefully it's not me. If you're in here this morning, I don't know any of you well enough. I don't think I'd make you that upset. But there's probably somebody. That's who Jonah went to. And that's who God had mercy for. But this is something I don't want to neglect to put this in there. God had mercy on them. Yes, because He loved them. Yes, because He's a forgiving God. But He had mercy on them because they repented. They turned from their evil way. They literally put on sackcloth and ashes. They fasted. They turned. And you and I, we have to extend this mercy, this forgiveness. But someone has to acknowledge at some point what they're doing. I mean, it's like my kids. If my kids, and listen, I have good kids. I can say that while they're here. I know they're humans. I know they have issues just like everybody else. But let's say my kids come to me and they say, Dad, I'm sorry. I don't know. Let's say, Dad, I'm sorry for not cleaning the kitchen like I told you. Which probably be Mom. I told Dave's going to clean the kitchen. But let's just face it. I mean, it's honest. And I say, okay, if you're really sorry, then you'll go do it. Isn't that what being sorry kind of is? And so when someone's done something to you or to me, we just want to know that they're really, genuinely sorry. But you have to be willing to extend that mercy to them, even your biggest enemy. And listen, I'll be quite frank and honest. That's hard to do. It's really hard to do sometimes. At one point in Matthew, literally says that if you don't forgive, those your enemies, if you don't forgive them, then neither will I forgive you. Your Father in heaven will forgive you. that's some pretty strong language. And so Jonah here, he gets to that point. He raises his white flag, if you want to call it that. He gives in. And he gets down chapter 4 at the end of it. It says, so Jonah, I think I've already told you part of this, but Jonah, he built this booth. He's sitting, he's looking at the city, and the way the King James puts it, said there's this big gourd comes up. I think the ESV says a plant. This plant grows up and shades Jonah, and Jonah's just sitting there like he's all happy about it. And then the next morning a worm comes out and eats the plant, and the plant's gone. And then the sun comes out and says Jonah gets so hot. He says, I wish I'd just died. So that's where Jonah's at. Chapter 4, verse 10. It says, and the Lord said, you pitied the plant for which you did not labor and make it grow. It came into being in just a night. And should not I, this is God talking, should not I pity Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who you do not know the right hand, who do not know the right hand from the left, and much cattle? Question mark. And I say that to say this. 2 books in the whole Bible begin with a question. We're left with this big blank slate. We have no idea if Jonah ever did change his mind. We don't know if Jonah actually, what Jonah did, it's a question mark. And so here, ironically enough, in ours, she was studying a book by Priscilla Shirer, I think, on Jonah this morning. She was finishing it up, and I was studying this, that we didn't intentionally work that out. But, so we were talking about it, and she showed me, here's what Priscilla Shirer said in the last chapter. I thought she had a couple of good points. It says, will you? So here's the question. It's less about Jonah, and it's more about you. It's more about me. Will you and I see the interruptions in life as divine intervention by God? Listen, God is either who he said he was, who he said he is, says he is, or he's not. I tend to believe he is. I know he is. I question sometimes why things happen, but I know he's in control. And just things that happen even in nature, all around us. I don't know, a deer may cross the road in front of you and you have to slow down. Maybe that's divine intervention to keep you from hitting the semi-truck up the road. I mean, I don't know. I'm just saying that God is still in control. So do we see that? And this was a big thing. Are you or me, are we willing to seek out Nineveh and extend the same mercy? It's a big question. And I'll go back to how I started. It's not all about you. It's not all about me. And even coming to church, it's not all about you or me. It's not about, well, I left there and I didn't get anything out of it. Well, I'm sorry, number one. We're sorry. But it's less about you and what you can get. It's about what we, as a body of believers, can do to encourage one another, to have mercy on each other. And even if your worst enemy come here this morning, would I be willing to extend the same mercy to them? Because listen, whoever they are still a child in the image of God. And I don't know about you. I mean, I've got 2 brothers. I guess that's what used to be a little bit of a relatively small family, but I know my parents, I believe they love us kind of equally. It's the same way with me and my daughters. I mean, I love them equally. They're different. Yes, they're created a little bit different, but I have to think that when God looks down and he sees you or I treating somebody like a mortal enemy, he's like, I created them just like I created you. And he's thinking, just extend mercy to them. Let me work out the other details. Maybe he will have something horrible come out and swallow him. I don't know. What is the psalmist says? Why? I was angry at the Lord and sit there and I went, why does the evil man prosper? I mean, even David, when he was writing the Psalms, he wondered about it. I wonder about it. I don't understand. But what I'm supposed to do, what you're supposed to do, is extend that mercy. Are we willing to do that? Are you and I willing to look at people who we know have treated us bad? Because you know what? It's not about you, it's not about me. You know, we can even talk just not necessarily even about our enemies, just talk about the church right here. You know, we came together, this great group of people we want to meet, and I know so many people have questions. It's like, well, we don't even know where we're going next week. You know what? I can't tell you. It probably doesn't bother anybody any more than it does me. I don't understand it, but I'm not going to, I don't know the name of the place. I know it's something, it's where Alex and Dalton got married. It's where we're leaving next week. And just understand this, that it's not about whether it's the greatest service ever. It's not about whether we have the most immaculate place to take our kids. Listen, I would personally love, you know, we continue to pray. I know my wife and I do, I know others do, I know Dalton and Alex pray, but I know Miss Sheila's still praying about, you know, what God wants us to do with the church. I know there's several of you that still pray about all that. But it's so much about us exhorting and loving one another. Just like Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25 said, when you get to the end of that whole thing about Jesus Christ. That is why we meet. And all I can say is, it's not about me. It's just about hoping and praying that we can have an influence on each other. Because I'm going to be quite honest, we need a lot of positive influences in our lives. Because you don't get it from social media. You don't get it from politics. I won't go into any detail, but just to say this, I was just talking this morning. God did not call me into politics. I'm glad He's called Christians into it. But the older I get, the less I care about, the less I want to hear about it, the more I just want to just proclaim the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ and say, I don't even know what's going on out there. Now you do have to know. I want to understand. But God didn't call me into that. Maybe He has called you into that. I want to support you in that. But what I want to do, what I want us to do is influence one another for good. To provoke, this is how Hebrews 10:24 says it, to provoke one another to love and good works. So, musicians, who ever seen it, can come this way. But just think of that. This story is not just about Jonah. It's left with a question mark because it's asking, how are you? How would you handle this? Would you forgive your enemy? I have to ask myself these same questions. So as we think about provoking one another to love and to good works, those that we do love, hopefully